The air inside the cramped control room of the Soviet submarine B-59 was thick with heat and tension. It was late October in the year 1962, and the vessel was submerged deep beneath the waves of the Caribbean Sea. Above them, the United States Navy was dropping depth charges in an attempt to force the submarine to surface. The explosions rocked the hull violently, and the temperature inside climbed to stifling levels. The captain of the submarine believed that war had already started on the surface. He ordered his crew to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. This was the moment where the world stood on the razor edge of total annihilation. The fate of millions rested in the hands of three officers deep underwater. Vasily Arkhipov was the man who stood between humanity and a nuclear winter. As the flotilla chief of staff on board, he refused to authorize the launch without confirmation from Moscow. The argument that ensued in that sweating metal tube was one of the most critical conversations in human history. Had he relented, the nuclear torpedo would have vaporized the American fleet and triggered a full-scale retaliation against the Soviet Union. This single event during the Cuban Missile Crisis perfectly encapsulates the terror of the Cold War. It was a conflict defined not by the battles fought, but by the catastrophic wars that were narrowly avoided through fear and diplomacy. To understand how the world reached this precipice, we must look back to the ashes of the Second World War. Europe lay in ruins, and the old powers of Britain and France were exhausted shadows of their former selves. Two giants emerged from the smoke and rubble to claim the mantle of global leadership. The United States of America stood as the economic powerhouse of the West, championing democracy and capitalism. To the east, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics commanded a vast empire built on communist ideology and centralized control. These two superpowers had been uneasy allies against Nazi Germany, but with the common enemy defeated, their deep ideological differences resurfaced with dangerous intensity. The stakes of this new confrontation were unlike anything the human race had ever seen before. Previous wars were fought with tanks and aircraft and soldiers on the battlefield. This new conflict would be fought under the looming shadow of the mushroom cloud. The development of the atomic bomb by the United States in 1945 changed the nature of warfare forever. When the Soviet Union detonated its own nuclear device in 1949, the balance of power shifted into a terrifying equilibrium. Both sides possessed the ability to destroy the other completely. This concept became known as mutually assured destruction. It was a grim pact that kept the peace through the promise of shared apocalypse. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin was the iron-fisted leader of the Soviet Union during these early years. He was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to protect Russia from future invasions. One by one, nations like Poland and Hungary and Romania fell under Soviet influence. Winston Churchill famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, dividing the democratic West from the communist East. The city of Berlin became the focal point of this division. Located deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, the city was split into sectors controlled by the Allied powers. It was an island of capitalism in a sea of red. In 1948, Stalin attempted to starve West Berlin into submission by blocking all road and rail access. He believed the Western powers would abandon the city rather than risk another war. The response from the United States and its allies was a massive logistical undertaking known as the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, cargo planes landed every few minutes, delivering food and coal and medicine to the besieged citizens. It was a triumph of logistics and determination that humiliated Stalin and forced him to lift the blockade. This victory cemented the resolve of the West and led to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The conflict soon expanded beyond the borders of Europe to engulf the entire globe. In 1950, the Korean peninsula erupted into violence as communist forces from the north invaded the south. The United States led a United Nations coalition to push back the aggressors, fearing that a failure to act would encourage communist expansion elsewhere. The Korean War was a brutal and bloody struggle that lasted for 3 years and claimed millions of lives. It ended in a stalemate that left the peninsula divided to this day. This war demonstrated that the Cold War would not be a bloodless standoff, but a series of violent proxy wars fought in distant lands. While soldiers fought in the mud of Korea, a different kind of battle was beginning in the laboratories and testing grounds of the superpowers. The arms race was a frantic sprint to build bigger and more destructive weapons. The atomic bomb was soon superseded by the hydrogen bomb, a weapon thousands of times more powerful. Scientists on both sides worked tirelessly to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering these warheads to targets on the other side of the world in minutes. The psychological toll on the public was immense. School children in the United States were taught to duck and cover under their desks in the event of a nuclear flash. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev rose to power in the Kremlin. He was a bombastic and unpredictable leader who alternated between calls for peaceful coexistence and aggressive threats. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union scored a major propaganda victory in 1957 by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The sight of the small metal sphere orbiting the Earth sent shockwaves through the American public. It suggested that the Soviet Union had surpassed the West in technology and missile capability. The space race had officially begun, and it became a contest for national prestige and military dominance. The United States scrambled to catch up, establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to lead its efforts. The rivalry extended to the skies above enemy territory, where espionage became a high-stakes game. The United States flew high-altitude U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union to photograph military installations. In 1960, one of these planes, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down by a Soviet missile. The incident caused a major diplomatic crisis and embarrassed President Dwight David Eisenhower, who had initially denied the flights existed. Trust between the two superpowers hit a new low. The city of Berlin remained a festering wound in the relationship between East and West. Thousands of East Germans were fleeing to the West every day, draining the communist state of its workforce and credibility. In August 1961, the East German government began the construction of a barrier that would become the most potent symbol of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall tore families apart and turned West Berlin into a prison fortress. Guards were ordered to shoot anyone attempting to escape. The concrete and barbed wire stood as a physical manifestation of the ideological divide that separated humanity. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a revolutionary leader named Fidel Alejandro Castro had seized power in Cuba. He aligned his island nation with the Soviet Union, bringing the communist threat to the doorstep of America. In 1961, the Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated a botched invasion at the Bay of Pigs, attempting to overthrow Castro. The failure emboldened the Soviet Union to secretly install nuclear missiles in Cuba. When American spy planes discovered the launch sites in October 1962, the world held its breath. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy ordered a naval blockade and demanded the removal of the weapons. For 13 agonizing days, the world waited for the first missile to fly. We return here to the moment inside the submarine B-59, where the decision of one man saved the world. Eventually, a deal was struck in secret. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and the United States agreed not to invade the island and to remove its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended, but the fear remained. A direct telephone hotline was established between the White House and the Kremlin to ensure that leaders could communicate instantly in future crises, preventing misunderstandings from escalating into war. As the 1960s progressed, the focus of the Cold War shifted to the jungles of Southeast Asia. The United States believed in the domino theory, which posited that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow. This belief led America into the quagmire of the Vietnam War. It was a conflict defined by guerrilla warfare in dense jungles and an elusive enemy. Despite their overwhelming technological superiority, American forces struggled to defeat the determination of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The war dragged on for years, tearing apart the social fabric of the United States. The Vietnam War was the first conflict to be broadcast nightly into the living rooms of American families. The images of burning villages and wounded soldiers fueled a massive anti-war movement. Protests erupted on college campuses and in city streets as the public questioned the morality and necessity of the war. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and China provided weapons and support to the communist forces in Vietnam, bleeding the American military and economy. It was a painful lesson for the United States on the limits of its power. The withdrawal of American troops in 1973 marked a significant retreat. While America struggled in Vietnam, the Soviet Union faced its own challenges within its sphere of influence. In 1968, the people of Czechoslovakia attempted to introduce liberal reforms during a brief period known as the Prague Spring. They sought socialism with a human face, including freedom of speech and less centralized control. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. Tanks from the Warsaw Pact nations rolled into the streets of Prague, crushing the reform movement and reasserting hardline communist control. This action demonstrated that the Soviet Union would not tolerate dissent within its empire. By the 1970s, both superpowers were weary of the constant tension and the economic burden of the arms race. A period of relaxation known as détente began. President Richard Milhous Nixon made a historic visit to China, exploiting a rift between the two communist giants to isolate the Soviet Union. He then traveled to Moscow to sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks treaties. These agreements placed limits on the number of nuclear missiles each side could possess. It seemed for a brief moment that the Cold War might be thawing and that a stable coexistence was possible. However, the struggle for influence continued in the shadows of the developing world. Proxy wars raged in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East. In Angola and Nicaragua and Ethiopia, factions backed by the United States and the Soviet Union fought for control. These conflicts devastated local populations and destabilized entire regions. The Cold War was not merely a standoff between two nations, but a global contest that touched every continent. The ideological battle was fought with Kalashnikovs and landmines in the hands of soldiers who often knew little of the grand geopolitics driving their war. The era of détente came to a crashing end in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The Soviets sought to prop up a failing communist government against Islamic insurgents. The United States saw this as a dangerous expansion of Soviet power toward the oil-rich Persian Gulf. President James Earl Carter responded by boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics and funding the insurgents known as the Mujahideen. The mountains of Afghanistan would become a graveyard for the Soviet army, just as the jungles of Vietnam had been for the Americans. In 1981, Ronald Wilson Reagan entered the White House with a renewed determination to confront the Soviet Union. He rejected the policy of containment and détente, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Reagan embarked on a massive military buildup, challenging the Soviet economy to keep pace. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based system designed to shoot down incoming nuclear missiles. Although the technology was not yet viable, the proposal terrified the Soviet leadership, who feared their nuclear deterrent would become obsolete. The Soviet economy was already rotting from the inside. Decades of central planning and military spending had left the country unable to provide basic goods for its citizens. Long lines for bread and shoes became a daily reality in Moscow. The war in Afghanistan was bleeding the treasury and the morale of the army. Into this crisis stepped Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev in 1985. He was a younger and more dynamic leader who recognized that the Soviet system needed desperate reform if it was to survive. He introduced two radical new policies known as glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost meant openness, allowing for greater freedom of speech and transparency in government. Perestroika meant restructuring, attempting to introduce market-like reforms to the stagnant economy. Gorbachev hoped these changes would revitalize communism, but instead they unleashed forces he could not control. Once the people were allowed to speak, they spoke of their desire for freedom and national independence. The grip of fear that had held the Soviet Empire together began to loosen. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster further exposed the incompetence and secrecy of the Soviet state. The year 1989 became the turning point where the question of the Cold War was finally answered. Would it end in fire or in the crumbling of the old order? Across Eastern Europe, the people rose up in peaceful protest. In Poland, the Solidarity movement led by Lech Walesa demanded free elections. In Hungary, the government began to dismantle the fence on the border with Austria. The pressure built until it exploded in the divided city of Berlin. On November 9th, a confused government official announced that travel restrictions were lifted immediately. Thousands of East Berliners flooded towards the checkpoints. The guards, outnumbered and without orders, stood aside. The gates opened and the people surged through. Jubilant crowds climbed atop the Berlin Wall, hacking at the concrete with hammers and chisels. The symbol of division was crumbling beneath the weight of human desire for freedom. It was a scene of pure joy that was broadcast around the world. The Iron Curtain had not been torn down by tanks or missiles, but by the will of the people. The Soviet Union did not intervene, signaling the end of its domination over Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Outer Empire was swift. By the end of 1989, communist regimes across Eastern Europe had fallen like dominoes. The revolution soon reached the heart of the Soviet Union itself. Republics like Lithuania and Estonia and Ukraine declared their independence. The hardline communists in Moscow attempted a coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, but the people and the military refused to support them. The coup failed and the authority of the Communist Party evaporated. The colossus that had terrified the world for decades was dissolving into history. On Christmas Day in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union. That evening, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. It was replaced by the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. The Cold War was officially over. The United States stood as the sole remaining superpower. The nuclear standoff that had threatened to extinguish all life on Earth had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet signature on a document. The legacy of the Cold War remains with us today. It shaped the geopolitical map of the modern world and left behind a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons that still require vigilance. It drove incredible technological advancements from the internet to satellite navigation. It also left deep scars in the nations where proxy wars were fought. The ideological struggle between liberty and control continues in new forms in the 21st century. The echoes of those decades of fear still whisper in the corridors of power. We must remember the lesson of the Cold War. It is a testament to the dangers of unchecked ideology and the terrifying power of modern weaponry. It also stands as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. When faced with the prospect of total destruction, humanity found a way to step back from the brink. The wall fell and the Iron Curtain was lifted. In the end, the desire for connection and freedom proved stronger than the walls built to divide us.